You're listening to the Optimal Performance Podcast. The OPP is brought to you by Natural Stacks, makers of 100% natural and open source supplements designed to help you live optimal. For more information on how to build optimal mental and physical performance into your life, go to naturalstacks.com. I wanted to talk just really briefly about one of my most favorite products from Natural Stacks, which is the Antarctic krill oil. All of us know already that we should be taking fish oil for our joint health, for our brain, and also for our own ability to reduce inflammation in our body. And the cool thing about the Antarctic krill oil from Natural Stacks is that it doesn't have that funky fish flavor. It doesn't have a smell, it doesn't stink, and you also don't burp it up, which is really common with other fish oils out on the market. And if you go to naturalstacks.com, you can actually read some reviews where people are talking about best krill oil out there, no aftertaste, no smell, really helps with my back, pain, and overall health. And you know it's sourced from quality. Natural Stacks products are rock solid. It's true. We test every single batch and we post the results of each of the batch on the website. So if you're interested to see what's actually in your supplements that you're spending money to take, you'll find exactly all the details that you'll need to know about the products that you're buying. As always, if you go to naturalstacks.com and you use the promo code MAC15, MAC15, you get 15% off your first online purchase. So if you want to go and stock up and really hit it hard, go ahead, jump in there, use the code MAC15 at checkout, and it's 15% off. This is a product that I use every single day, that my family uses every day, because of its overall general health benefits. So go to naturalstacks.com and take me up on this fly offer. For those of you that may not already know, we're having a spring sale. So go ahead to naturalstacks.com and stack up, see what I did there, on 3 new products that we're carrying. They're pretty cool, actually. For those of you who take CILTEP on a regular basis, we're introducing a new CILTEP to-go pack, also a MagTech drink mix. In addition to that, we've also got a brain food set for those of you who have been taking the acetylcholine brain food, serotonin brain food, dopamine brain food, or the GABA brain food, or the four guys that are in the brain nutrients box set. There's special offers. So go to naturalstacks.com and stack up while the time is right. And we want to hear what your thoughts are. As always, please give us reviews, send us emails. We're human beings at Natural Stacks. We're real, actual people trying to provide you with the best possible vitamins and supplements that you can actually take into your body to make you more optimal. We went there. Yep, I took it there. We went to microdosing. This week's episode, I sit down with Paul Austin and we have a conversation about microdosing using sub-perceptual doses of psychedelics to perform at a higher level. And we cover psilocybin and LSD and MDMA. We talk about the different applications of using microdoses, not only to perform at a higher level and to think more creatively, but also to reduce anxiety and depression. I think that we're going to look back 10 or 20 years from now, and when all of this is legal and mainstream, and we're going to look back and think, man, what were we doing? Why weren't we doing this earlier? This is a really wide-ranging conversation, but we also get very specific and narrow about which psychedelics can be used at what doses for what effect. We talk about the work that he's doing in Amsterdam, hosting retreats where people can do psychedelics and also explore their consciousness and open up and perform at a higher level. And for those of you guys who are already pushing the boundary and tinkering with your brain and your performance and your ability to be your absolute best, I think you're going to get a ton out of this episode. I want your feedback on this. Please let me know. Do you like this stuff? Is this stuff interesting? Because it's super fascinating to me, and I know you're going to love this conversation. Paul Austin is a totally stand-up guy, and the work that he's doing, I think, is really, really important because in the world of pharmaceuticals and prescription drugs, there is an alternative, and it may just be microdosing psychedelic substances. I think you guys are really going to dig this episode. And ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Paul Austin. You're listening to the Optimal Performance Podcast, and I'm your host, Sean McCormick. It's the OPP. I'm a performance coach, a wellness entrepreneur, a blogger, a speaker, a biohacker, and it's my privilege to bring to you the leading experts in the field of performance. So let's dig right in. So we're here with Paul Austin. Paul, thanks for joining us today, man.
Thanks for having me on, Sean. I was super excited to get your message the other day and make this happen. I love what you're doing with this podcast, so I'm down to jam about microdosing and psychedelics and all the good stuff.
Awesome. One way that I like to start each of these episodes is to ask people what they're on. What do you have? What have you put in your body today? It's 10:30 Pacific Standard Time. What's inside you? What have you put in your body today?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I'm glad you asked that. So the typical thing is, wake up in the morning and vitamin D with fish oil, and then I will take rhodiola, which is an adaptogen that comes from Russia, and I took some psilocybin mushrooms as well. So a very, very sub-perceptual amount, a very low amount. And then, in terms of other drugs, coffee. So I had some caffeine. And then I've also been trying nicotine, which is a bit of a risky ploy, but I got something called the Juul, and I've been also looking at that from just a stimulant perspective, what the impact of that is. So those are kind of and I'm fasting, I haven't eaten yet as well. So it's that's kind of what's going on right now. Nice.
Do you have black coffee?
I had a little bit of milk, so maybe it's not like a hard fast, but the idea is just, never eat breakfast and only have like a coffee in the morning and then see where it goes from there.
Yeah. What dose of which psilocybin today?
So it's interesting, with psilocybin mushrooms being still illegal in the States, there's a guy who's trying to basically cultivate, instead of the fruiting spores of the mushrooms, he's cultivating the mycelium, which is the underground sort of stuff. And so he sent me a sample, and so it has a really, really low density compared to the fruiting spores of psilocybin mushrooms. So I just took 2 of those little pills. I don't know the exact amount that's in them, unfortunately, but it's not enough to have any sort of noticeable effect. Like sometimes when I microdose, I'll take a little bit, technically more than a microdose, so I'll feel a little euphoria. My sense of smell or touch will be slightly enhanced. With this, it's very kind of under the radar. And then the reason I'm doing that is because I'm trying to, instead of microdosing as in a drug, which has a noticeable impact, I'm trying to microdose as like a supplement, like a fish oil, to help facilitate neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, because of the impact that microdosing has on the brain and the gut. So that's kind of the approach right now that I'm going for.
Excellent. Ooh, we're gonna have a lot to talk about, Paul. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Do you know what mushroom specifically?
So it's psilocybe cubensis, which is the typical psychoactive mushroom that most people will consume for microdosing. Yeah,
cool. It's interesting. I have not heard of anybody microdosing the mycelium. It's all fruited body, ground up, encapsulated, and in my experience, it's 0.2 to 0.3 grams for that sort of classic sub-perceptual or barely perceptible sort of dose for classic microdosing. And here in Seattle, I think much like Silicon Valley, there's so much innovation, there's so much tech, there's so much focus. It's becoming more and more common, and I get lots of questions. You can imagine, as a float center owner and podcast host, there's lots of, I'm sort of the go-to guy for a lot of people to ask these questions. So it's I'm really excited to dig in. Walk us through, if you will, first I saw that you were vaping. What are you vaping? Is that the nicotine?
So that's the nicotine. Yeah, that's the nicotine that I'm vaping. I won't vape cannabis typically during the day because cannabis just, while it helps with like presence and creativity, and particularly in social situations, for me, it's just something I can't do until the end of the day because I'm not as on point and focused. So I've been vaping with the nicotine a little bit. It's kind of like a short experiment. Like, I don't want to become addicted because that's not fun. But I do just want to see the impact and effect it has. So I've been vaping with the Juul a little bit.
Cool. Walk us through your first psychedelic experience. I'm sure that we could devote 4 podcasts to talk about the ins and outs of what was going on externally and internally, but I'd love to get a sense of your first impression.
Yeah, so I'll kind of give you the framework of how that developed. Basically, I grew up in West Michigan, near a little city called Grand Rapids. I went to school in a place called Holland, which is right on Lake Michigan. And West Michigan is very traditional in that, a bunch of basically poor Dutch farmers moved there in the early 20th century, and they brought with them, this strong kind of sense of Calvinism, Protestants, this whole thing. So I grew up in a very traditional family where we went to church every Sunday, and anything that was illegal was bad. So no drinking till 21, no rated R movies till I was 17. I had a good friend of mine who always made fun of me because I grew up so sheltered. So I was like, all right, yeah. And then when I was 16, I smoked some weed and was like, oh, there's something to this. And then when I was 19, I was in college and had a close friend of mine who's like, yeah, I did acid and it was the best fucking experience of my life. So I'm like, this sounds really cool. So I took acid in early May, was like 70, 75, sunny out. And the beautiful thing about West Michigan is we have these amazing sand dunes that are right on the lake. And when I'm talking about lake, it's, it's basically like an ocean, right, because Lake Michigan is so big. So we basically dropped some acid, went out to the sand dunes and the woods and hiked around there and enjoyed the experience on this beautiful early May day with 4 or 5 other people. And I just remember having all of these insights and deep understanding of my relationship to other things. And I think this is kind of the quote unquote common experience that people, have when they take a psychedelic, is a sense of interconnectedness, where we understand that we're not just these kind of individual egos that exist isolated from everything else. And in fact, we share a deep connection to community. We share a deep connection to the earth. We share a deep connection to, our friends and our family. And so that really helped to put in perspective what is most valuable in my life. And up to that point in time, I lived a more, traditional American life where, I like, kind of the consumerist mindset. And the biggest paradigm shift for me when, after taking psychedelics for the first time was reorienting towards experiential wealth rather than financial wealth. And that's why then I chose to pursue, everything that I'm currently doing.
Yeah. The term experiential wealth is not one that I've heard before, but yes, absolutely. Totally get it. Right. I realize that I'm going to struggle in this podcast because I'm going to want to share too, and I'm going to want to talk about my experiences, but
well, do you want to do that? I mean, what should I play podcast host? Okay.
Let's make this about you, because I'm going to have lots of opportunities to talk about my experience. And my other podcast, the Mystic Mac podcast, is devoted to consciousness exploration, psychedelics, breathwork, floating, spirituality, spiritual awakening. So I have another platform for that. But what was the conversation like with your folks when they first learned what you were doing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So like I mentioned, I grew up in this traditional kind of familial structure, and, my mom's a social worker. My dad is an administrator at the university that I went to. They're not conservative in how we understand it from an American sense. They vote liberal Democrat. My mom's a feminist, et cetera, but very normative. These are the rules and we follow them. And so when I was 24, so in 2014, I remember having the conversation with my mom about and it just kind of came out randomly, but I'm like, yeah, I do psychedelics and I've done them a lot and I will continue to do them. And of course, her first reaction was, whoa, you're going to turn into I think she said a wet noodle, because of the impact that psychedelics have in your brain. And so ever since that point in time, and in late 2014, I hadn't started the third wave yet. This was still maybe 8 months before I actually started the public website. But then throughout that process, from the end of 2014 to now, I've really seen an amazing transformation in how, understanding my parents are of both the work that I'm doing, but also, the research and the science that's coming out about psychedelic substance. And I think this is indicative of what's going on, at wide in our culture. Is a lot of people are misinformed about psychedelic substances. In fact, the biggest issue around psychedelics is a lack of literacy. Most people just don't, they're not educated around them. So I've seen this as I've engaged with my parents about this topic. They are starting to reach out to me about things like, my dad mentioned that someone that he knows has been struggling with depression and was wondering if I had any research to share about the efficacy of psychedelics in treating depression. My mom told me that she recently met with her church group and that they asked what I was up to. What I was doing. And she told them that I run this website about microdosing and do coaching and consulting for people who are interested in microdosing LSD. And then went on to tell them how there's all this research coming out about how it treats PTSD and depression and addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this speaks to the necessity of being honest and open and authentic about, for example, our own psychedelic experiences, because, the biggest issue that we still deal with as a culture is stigma around psychedelic substances, because there are still, so many people who, although they've had really transformative, impactful experiences, they won't speak publicly about it because they're afraid of losing their job, or they're afraid of losing their family, or they're afraid of losing friends, or whatever it might be. And I've been fortunate enough to not have to worry about those things because I'm very independent. I had my own business before I started the third wave. So I like to speak my truth, and I like to do it in a way that I think is the right way. So that has then, catalyzed this incredible shift in my family in terms of their own, kind of orientation towards psychedelic substances.
Yeah, I mean, we need more people to step out of the psychedelic closet and have open adult conversations, because the deck is stacked against us. There's the demonization of cannabis, for one, has worked. It's been DARE has worked, unfortunately. And that's why people from the baby boomer generation think of cannabis as the same way that they think of heroin. And it's obviously misinformed and toxic. And you and I are in agreement that it is going to have, it's going to continue to have stifling effects for our culture to grow, and for our leaders to lead in a more embodied way, to lead in a more conscious, more supportive, more interconnected way. So kudos to you for not only stepping out, but stepping out and beating a drum and rallying people and saying, hey, let's all step out. Let's all talk about this. Let's rally for this thing. And it's really, really encouraging. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Well, let's talk a little bit about the different substances, because our listeners are tinkerers and experimenters. And, I don't know how much you know about the different product lines that we have. We have 3 different microdosing microdosing products. No, we don't.
That'd be tight. That'd be so tight.
No, we don't. We have three mushroom products. And everybody that's listening to this knows how effective supplementation is in their life. So let's talk a little bit about the differences in the way that these substances can be used in a microdosing format. So like what's the difference between microdosing LSD and microdosing psilocybin?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just for the sake of argument, they're by and large the same because they have by and large the same impact on the brain. I think there are slight differences between LSD and psilocybin, and kind of the way that I like to boil it down to for people to understand is LSD is much more head focused and psilocybin is much more heart focused. So in other words, LSD helps a lot more with cognitive enhancement and improvement, although psilocybin also helps with that. And psilocybin seems to be more oriented towards emotional development and emotional maturity in terms of really feeling into situations and developing that intuition that is really important. So I think that has always been the main difference that I've noticed in utilizing these substances. LSD is also, it's a semi-synthetic, whereas psilocybin is, it's a plant medicine. So for that reason, LSD also comes with slightly more risk. It's longer lasting. LSD lasts 12 hours, whereas psilocybin is just 6 hours. So for people, for example, who want to microdose but struggle with insomnia, LSD is not a good option because LSD is much more dopaminergic than psilocybin. In other words, it's more active in the dopamine system, which is tied to energy. And so I think that's why LSD has become so, kind of this popular thing in Silicon Valley, because a lot of people are microdosed for enhanced productivity and creativity. And in essence, they're microdosing to help with external creative projects, because LSD helps with that extroversion process. Whereas we're not seeing near as many stories about psilocybin because those who are microdosing with psilocybin, I think, are doing it more from an emotional development and kind of mental health perspective.
Yeah, I totally see that. And I've come to understand that as well in my own experience and also in the people that I speak to. On that note, I've heard a couple of times recently that microdosing as a trend, as a movement, as a supplementation method, that in some way, microdosing LSD, let's just use Silicon Valley as an example, like that microdosing LSD may in fact be contributing to an imbalance in sort of work life. Is it making us work too hard? Are we using the substance to advance the Western war machine and overwork and undersleep and neglect our families? Like I think it's certainly worthwhile talking about, and I wonder if you've seen that and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no. So in other words, what role does microdosing play in this kind of cultural burnout that we seem to be experiencing? So a lot of research shows that although, for example, salaries have stagnated since whatever, the 80s or the 90s, people are working now more than ever because, our quote unquote capitalist overlords are just demanding so much from us. And although I think that is a slightly cynical angle, I think there is a certain element of truth to that. In that, psychedelics, as they are non-specific amplifiers, meaning that they don't have inherently any sort of good or bad qualities, that oftentimes psychedelics act as this facilitator towards what's going on at culture at large. So if you have a culture that, particularly I think this is true in the United States, overemphasizes work and productivity, in other words, if I can microdose and then I can get done in 8 hours what used to take me 16 hours, then what if I work 12-hour days, I can get done a whole day, whatever, that kind of mentality I think ultimately is unhealthy, which is why, what we're trying to do at the Third Wave with a lot of the public speaking that we've done, with a lot of the articles that we produce, is kind of reframe how we approach work in the first place. In other words, I think as a culture, we need to become more comfortable with not working. I think in many ways, our culture basically fills these holes that we have from childhood neglect or trauma or whatever it might be with work. We overwork and we overwork and we overwork. And with things like AI and automation that are starting to develop, in other words, a lot of the rote tasks that we previously had to do won't be necessary anymore. It's going to be up to thought leaders and people who are continuing to develop this conversation to emphasize the importance of self-care and personal time. In other words, how do we utilize microdosing, which looks to initiate flow states, which is an interesting concept in itself, to potentially do creative work, what used to take us 8 hours, to do it in 4 hours, which means then we can go hang out with friends more often, we can go travel more, we can go, go out to meals, cook, create, do art, whatever it might be. I think the best use of microdosing is within that paradigm. In other words, to pursue creative work, to be more effective at focusing on that creative work and quote unquote getting it done, and then to use the remainder of our time to really enjoy the sense of being alive. And so yeah, that's a risk, like the sense of burnout. And I think it's partly why it's become so popular in Silicon Valley, is because you have a lot of people who are in front of their computers all day, who are isolated, who are really not taking good care of themselves, and to compensate for that, they're microdosing because of its euphoric effects and its antidepressant effects. And I do think that's unhealthy. I think ultimately we do need to have that conversation about how do we utilize microdosing as a tool to help us mature as a culture, which I think part of that maturation process is to let go of these kind of Protestant work ethic norms and to really actually immerse ourselves in the beauty of everything that is life, not just in, being more productive, so to say.
Yeah. Well, and your role at the Third Wave and your role as a coach is to help people navigate that, right?
Right.
Are you microdosing 5 days a week and working until 8 o'clock at night, neglecting your kids? You should look at that.
Right.
before we go any further, I think the elephant in the room is the legality. And you're probably sick of talking about it, but I think that for people who are uninitiated, who have either never taken a psychedelic or they, secretly smoke weed and they think that they're the only one, there's the legal aspect of it. And so I'd love to delve into how you handle that and what sort of implications the legality comes into with the work that you do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think up front, nothing's happened so far, and knock on wood. I hope that continues, because really all we're doing is we're providing education and information about these substances so people can make rational, empirical based decisions on what they want to put in their own bodies. So when it comes to legality, obviously all of these substances are Schedule I substances in the United States specifically. So one way, of course, to get around that legality is to go to Mexico or Peru or Brazil or Amsterdam. In fact, we're doing a retreat in Amsterdam in a couple weeks with psilocybin truffles because they're legal there. You can purchase them in a smart shop. So to keep on the right side of the law, all we do is provide education and information. We don't explicitly provide any sort of substance. So for example, if we have someone who wants to come work with us as a client, it's up to them to source the substance themselves. Now we do provide, I do provide nuance understanding of the legality around these substances. So one thing to know is that regular LSD is illegal everywhere, pretty much. It's not possible to acquire really regular LSD without breaking the law. However, there's nuance within that. There's a substance called 1P LSD, which is made in labs in Canada, and a lot of people will order it on the regular web, not the dark web, the regular web. They'll pay with crypto, and they'll get it shipped to their home, whether in Canada or the United States. Another legal loophole that a lot of people aren't aware of is it's legal to purchase psilocybin spores. So you can actually purchase the spores of psilocybin mushrooms in every state except California, Georgia, and Idaho. But of course, it's illegal to grow them. But this is why we have laws in place in the United States to protect people from improper search and seizure. So a lot of people are doing that, where they're legally purchasing the spores and then they're choosing to grow them in their own house for medicinal or peak performance use. So that's kind of how we deal with the legal aspects. My hope is that with the work that we're doing around advocacy, with a lot of the larger conversations that are going on around drug policy, in terms of, Norway, for example, just decriminalized all drugs. Oregon just decriminalized all drugs, meaning that if you have a drug, it goes from a felony to a misdemeanor. Denver right now is trying to pass a measure to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms, which I'm really hoping passes, because if it does, I'll probably move there. So there are all these other narratives going on that I think we're on the right side of history, and that as long as we keep pushing forward, that the laws will continue to change, and we'll find ourselves with more and more freedom to actively explore our consciousness the way that we want to.
Yeah. We should be able to explore our consciousness, right? I think about the Graham Hancock conversation about consciousness sovereignty. Telling me that I can't explore my consciousness through whatever means is inhumane.
Well, it's a human right. The sense of exploring our consciousness, I think, is a human right. And this is where we get to these normative rules that we have around what drugs are okay and what drugs aren't. So obviously, nicotine is an okay drug. Tobacco, even though it's linked, tobacco specifically is linked to lung cancer and all these other issues. Alcohol is a normative drug. But of course, there are so many fucking issues that come with alcohol. Now, I drink wine and beer, and I have the occasional mezcal and whatnot. But at the same time, the state should not be able to sanction which altered states we're able to engage with and which ones we're not able to engage with. And we're seeing this play out in the opiate crisis right now, where these legal drugs, opiates, are now creating this massive fucking health crisis because doctors were incentivized by for-profit pharmaceutical companies to overprescribe them, which is just a fucked up situation and scenario in itself. So yeah. This whole sense of what's okay and what's not, particularly from a legal perspective, I think a lot of people are just starting to shift their mindset on it because they realize that they've been lied to, manipulated for a long time about these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard recently that going back to the mindset of the hard-charging, hard-working Silicon Valley person, in my practice and in my world, I have seen Adderall have really tricky effects for people, especially in long-term use. And I heard recently that microdosing may be a good way to step off of Adderall. Have you heard anything about that? Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, so I think then this is when we start to talk about microdosing as a nootropic, right? We start to look at microdosing particularly from a cognitive enhancement perspective, and then we compare microdosing to other cognitive enhancers. So kind of the most common ones that we know of are caffeine, nicotine, modafinil is another one, Adderall is obviously one, and all of these substances, all of these nootropics, Adderall, whatever they are, they help with convergent thinking, which is this process of you have a bunch of tasks that need to get done, you need to focus on getting those tasks done. They're not necessarily creative in nature, they're just things that need to happen. And so we take drugs to facilitate that process, certain types of drugs. Whereas with microdosing seems to help with this divergent thinking process, this creativity process. And so a lot of people are noticing that the underlying issue of why they can't focus, for example, it's partly because they're not able to engage and be, interested in the work that they're doing. And so I think with something like microdosing, I think that also helps to facilitate that engagement process. It helps to make people more externally engaged in the work that they're doing because it helps them to initiate flow states. So I know of numerous stories of people who are transitioning off of Adderall and onto microdoses of LSD because, unlike Adderall, microdoses are not addictive. Anyone who's been on Adderall before and has tried to wean off it can probably speak to the fucking shit show that they go through when trying to make that happen. And so, I think that is why microdosing is just a much better nootropic in general, because people will microdose consistently, and then if they want to stop, they stop. And there's no withdrawals. There's no sort of like, I have this craving. It's just, you're done. And so I think it's a much healthier and more sustainable alternative than Adderall. And in fact, there was just a documentary that was published on Netflix about this exact topic. How, I forget the name of the documentary because I haven't watched it yet, but I know Jim Fadman, who has kind of heard a lot of this microdosing craze, was in it. And basically at the end of the documentary, they kind of profile all these issues that go on with, Adderall and these performance enhancement ADHD medications. And their recommendation at the end is to transition to microdosing LSD, which I agree with wholeheartedly, because like I said, it's a more sustainable alternative.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any experience with Adderall or, those?
Just with clients. Yeah. Just with clients and friends. I myself have never, I went through, when I was building my businesses, I was using Provigil, modafinil. I've tried Adderall a couple of times, but not with me personally. It's with clients that I work with, hard-charging, hard-working, successful people that take it as a nootropic to get an edge, or they've been prescribed it and they just abuse it, and then they get themselves stuck, and then they can't think critically without it, and they stop for a day or two, and they're depressed and anxious and downtrodden, and then that only deepens their connection to it, and they need it, and they go back to it, and they need higher doses and more frequent use. And so I think, for those stimulants, for those nootropics, and for those prescribed drugs that are helping people perform at a high level, I think that would be, I think, a really beneficial approach to using and microdosing various substances, because it's there's something there, but you don't really see it. You kind of feel it, and then you just get your work done and you go for it, and it moves in a more fluid way. And then in my experience is that it really does help people transition off of it. I need to go get my computer charger. Give me 1 minute, if you would.
Take your time. No worries.
Okay. Oh shit.
I'm still here. Yep. Got your charger?
Got it.
Got your charger?
Got it. Yeah, I lost video on you. Was that on purpose?
Oh yeah, no, I just turned it off.
Okay. All right. Yeah, those long ones are really messing with my mojo.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you want to respond? Do you want to respond to that? You can't.
No. Let's keep going.
Okay. Can you give us an idea? Give us a story. Tell us an anecdote of somebody that you've worked with who's microdosed for a purpose with your coaching and help and assistance that has seen a cool result. Do you have like an anecdote story for us?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the work that we've done so far, like I've done a lot of like initial calls, so to say, like consulting calls, and this, but they've been more about like getting people set up and making sure they have the right information and proper information. I took a step back on doing the ongoing coaching until we had a more rigorous program to bring people through. So we've just finished the development of that, and we're actually rolling out, the kind of like not high end, but just long form coaching process at the moment, where microdosing is part of a larger program for peak performance. So in terms of like a clear anecdote, we have plenty from our microdosing course that we put together. And basically I put together the microdosing course because I was getting all these questions. And I thought, well, why not just create an online course where everyone can access and get all this information? So we have quite a few anecdotes from there of people who are starting to microdose through the course. But in terms of my own like personal one-on-one work, I've limited it the past 6 months. to focus on developing certain like things within the business. And it's only now that we're starting to do like outreach again to bring in people who want to work with us in a one-on-one way. So like I don't have any like strong anecdotes like off the top of my head that I could give, only because we've kind of limited the number of people that we've been working with over the past 6 months.
What was it like? How did your life change after that Rolling Stone article?
Yeah, the article that you're talking about, I'll just provide some context so that, the listeners have like an idea. It was about some of the coaching and consulting that I've done with the microdosing. I think the headline of it was "Meet the world's first online LSD microdosing coach." So any title that has "world's first," it's kind of like a funny little thing. So basically, from that process, just like we had gotten a little bit of media before that. So we were briefly mentioned in the New York Times, The Economist, a few other Life Hacker, a few other things. But then with that Rolling Stone kind of profile piece, that's when a lot of the larger media started to happen. So there were a couple speaking gigs. Business Insider wrote up something about us, WebMD, and now we have a whole slew of media coming out: Wired, Vox, Now This, Forbes, that are also doing more things. So a lot of it has been media driven. A lot of it has been public facing, and of course just generally then the continued increase in interest and awareness of what we're doing at the third wave. Because I think that's the larger narrative that I'm really focused on and interested in is like what role does microdosing play in helping people to adopt a higher level of psychedelic literacy? In other words, microdosing as a topic is getting a lot of people to engage with psychedelics who maybe previously did not engage with it. And so that's kind of the big question that I'm interested in exploring, is how do we continue to amplify this message so that we can, in essence, change the cultural conversation around psychedelics, where they're not this drug that people do who want to opt out of society, but in fact, it's a substance that we have individuals use who want to transform themselves. So then from that process and transforming themselves, they also transform the society in which we live. And we were talking about this earlier on the call, my clear focus then is this relationship between microdosing and peak performance. And not only in the kind of like quantitative measurements of, better fitness, more time spent in flow, maybe a better meditation practice, but also kind of the intangibles of leadership and presence, authenticity, openness, honesty, integrity. I think psychedelics also present this tremendous opportunity for us to mature as a culture and society, where we go from this really sort of short-term, profit-focused mindset to this long-term sustainability, eco-focused mindset. Because obviously the biggest issue that we're dealing with as a culture and society right now is ecocide, which is basically killing the environment. And I think that for me is where microdosing is really interesting.
Yeah, as you talk about the distinction between, it just brings up, the Timothy Leary quote, like tune in, drop out. And this is not that. This is not tune in, drop out, detach yourself from a society that you feel already out of place in. This is lean forward. This is find flow, find integration with the people that you live with and the people that you work with and the projects that you're engaging in. And I think that is such a stark deviation from the way that sort of classical psychedelics, and it gets to the name, the third wave, right?
Right.
This is not about tie-dye t-shirts and string cheese incident. This is about string cheese incident. If you're listening, I love you. This is not about that. This is about leaning into your life. This is about higher performance and more conscious and embodied performance. And I think that has it been an uphill battle to make that distinction for people?
Well, I think this gets into like the importance of language and the importance of I came upon this word schema the other day in a book, which is like basically high-end concepts that people can really pick up on. So the way that we phrase it is like rebranding psychedelics. And in essence, that's really what we're trying to do. I mean, if you go and you look at our website, The Third Wave, it's very professional in how it's done. If you were to go to it and you didn't know what the topic was about, you wouldn't think it was necessarily about psychedelics, because of the way that we present information, the way the whole user interface works. And obviously microdosing is a part of that, but also high doses can be a part of that as well. Because that has been the main kind of cultural misunderstanding of psychedelics, is people perceive them as being something that the other do. When in fact, I think psychedelics really are about having the courage to pursue what's most meaningful to you. And this is why I've been so adamant about them, is because I think a lot of people are living inauthentic lives. They're living lives where they're not necessarily in alignment with who they are and what they want to pursue. And I think more and more people have this kind of deep yearning desire to pursue work that's meaningful for them. And I think that is one of the opportunities that intentional, responsible, structured psychedelic use presents, is being able to cultivate this sense of deep self-insight and self-reflection to then orient yourself on a path that brings meaning and purpose in the long term. So that for me is one of the interesting parts of microdosing and psychedelics, and it's something that I've lived and embodied myself, which I think is why people when I go up on stage and like I talk about microdosing at tech conferences and shit, like a lot of those people have never done psychedelics, but if I get up on stage and I say something that I'll often do is I'll be like, hey, I microdosed, like I'm on LSD right now and I'm going to give this talk. And so all of a sudden then you present people with this opportunity to, okay, do I believe all the bullshit that I've heard, or do I actually like remain present and engage with this individual who just told me he was on LSD and he just gave like a pretty decent presentation about microdosing. And so this is the way that we change minds, right? This is the way that we engage with people to actually change the conversation, is you speak to them on an emotional, heart-driven level. And so while it's certainly been, an uphill battle, there's obviously enough cultural momentum going on around this that people like you, when you ask me to be on a podcast like this, or generally some of the media that we've gotten, or the conferences that I've been invited to, more and more people are willing to stick out their neck for this because they realize that it's an important topic, and a topic that's only going to become increasingly relevant as we deal with a lot of these, mental health issues and ecological issues and other issues that psychedelics seem to help, heal and help us to process and deal with.
Who do you see as benefiting the most from microdosing?
Yeah, it's a comparative question. So, let's break this down into who's microdosing, right? So what groups of people are microdosing? I think the first group of people who are microdosing are those, the typical people that we read about in a lot of the articles. It's people like me, people who are interested in peak performance, people who are listening to the show. They're interested in flow states. They're interested in high levels of creativity. They're interested in self-actualization. They're interested in, pursuing work that's meaningful and whatnot for them. And I think these people who we could say are already pretty healthy, they're already pretty functional, they just want to continue to expand their horizons and boundaries. They really want to explore what's out there. I think this proves, both microdoses and higher doses are tremendous for that process. But I also think obviously we have to pay attention to those people who are suffering, so to say. So people who have depression, who have anxiety, who have addiction, who have PTSD. What we do know more or less as a fact is a lot of our current approaches for mental illness are failures. I mean, I just remember I recently read a research paper that showed that when it comes to depression, for example, placebo is effective 40% of the time for depression. Antidepressants are effective 41% of the time, meaning that there's basically no difference between an antidepressant and placebo to treat depression. This is an issue because we know, for example, from the research that's happened with psychedelics, that psychedelics they clinically reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression in 80% of people. And that's compared to a placebo, 80% of people, which is so much more effective. And so I think that's then, I think the people who could use it more right now in terms of really need it, because I think with peak performance, there's obviously things like meditation, there's things like, I don't know, name your thing that you want to use for peak performance. There's a lot of things out there. But I think people who are struggling with intractable issues, I think this offers a hope for them that nothing else has offered yet. And I think obviously there's a relationship there, meaning it's not just black and white, people who have mental illness and people who don't. But it is, I think, more prescient for those who have tried everything else and nothing has worked. And this is something that's helped a lot of people where other things haven't.
That 80% figure is so key. Not many people know that, and the reason that they don't is because they really trust their doctor and believe the hype, and there's so much money supporting pharmaceuticals that just tear people apart and tear families apart. That 80% is massive. I mean, it's why we're talking, it's why we're having this conversation, and seeing how depression is now the number one mental illness. Mental illness is a loaded term, but on the planet right now, the fact that so many people are depressed, and the fact that there's a high comorbidity rate between anxiety and depression, which means that if you have depression, you're probably super anxious. And if you're anxious, you're probably depressed at some level as well. We need to figure this thing out globally. We need to find every alternative therapy, or every therapy that we can to help turn this thing around. And because psychedelics have such strong results, and because of the work that MAPS is doing to advocate for MDMA assisted psychotherapy and psilocybin for PSD, there's such room for this work in microdosing to help combat depression. I see it all the time as a float center owner and as a coach. I talk to people all the time that are just at wit's end. They feel they're stressed out, they're depressed, they're anxious. They've tried meditation. It's hard. Floating is easier, but you have to actually drive over to the float center and shower and lie back in 1,000 pounds of salt water and shower afterward. It's a thing, People want a quick fix, but vitamin D and exercise, or krill oil and exercise, fish oil and exercise, probably works better than antidepressants.
Right.
And yeah.
But it's not profitable. I mean, this has been the crux of the main issue around both the opiate crisis and the mental health epidemic. Is we've built these narratives around for-profit companies that are pursuing this, meaning they must get their money back. They have investors who want that money back for all the R&D that they've done. Really, the actual key is much simpler, and it's education. I mean, that really is the key to actually empowering autonomy in individuals to actually make significant improvements in their health: exercise, sleep, and diet. I mean, it comes down to those three things, and then everything else: float tanks, meditation, microdosing, whatever else. Those I think are the cherry on top, so to say, where they can help even more. But really, I think it's a lot of just getting the basics down. And this is where I think microdosing also can play a role, is it gets people out of ruts. Like you were saying, meditation, getting into meditation can be difficult. Starting a meditation habit can be challenging. Float tanks, they can be pricey for some people. It's like $60 to $80 or whatever, depending. I don't know what the price is in Seattle, but this is like New York. For one time, it's $60 to $80 to go. Microdosing, it's fucking cheap. It's about $1 every time you microdose, maybe less. And it's helping people to kind of get kickstarted. And I think this is the key with microdosing, is to utilize it within a larger framework of transforming your life, because it does help with that initiation process. It helps people to get up and going. But then once you have that energy to get up and going, where does that energy go towards? How is that energy being directed? And I think this is part of the work that I've been interested in, is how does it fit within a larger self-optimization protocol? So I'm actually starting a really interesting self-optimization experiment pretty soon, where I've done my 23andMe genetic testing, so I have all the raw data from that. And then I'm doing the uBiome, which tests and measures your microbiome. And then I bought the Aura Ring, which measures and tracks sleep quality. And then I'm going to do blood panels. And basically what I'm doing is I'm setting up an experiment where I'm going to get a baseline for all of them. So I'll get a baseline for my microbiome, I'll get a baseline for my sleep quality, and I'll get a baseline for my blood panels. And then I'll introduce a combination of CrossFit and ketogenic dieting for 2 months to see how that affects the different, microbiome, blood panel, sleep quality. And then I'm going to introduce microdosing 2 to 3 times a week and measure the impact and efficacy of that. Because I think, this is the big question that we're all dealing with right now, is what actual impact does microdosing have beyond some of the anecdotal reports? And I think the more that personalized medicine develops, the better we'll be able to create customized psychedelic protocols for individuals based on their specific genetic history, based on where they're at right now to treat certain issues and conditions and things like that.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing.
It's fucking fascinating.
That's great.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. This is the first time I've talked about it publicly, but it's like it really is something that obviously I've kind of been doing a lot of this my whole life. But I think this will be just another level up in terms of really being able to quantify and understand, okay, what impact does microdosing have within a larger holistic health routine in sleep quality, diet, and fitness, and measurement.
It begs the question, like, where do you see microdosing in the future? If you're, if you're talking about, let's just say, 5 or 10 years from now, everybody does this. Everybody tracks these biomarkers, sleep, blood, stools, whatever, neurofeedback or whatever, to be able to say, okay, you're low here, you're high here. You may benefit from this schedule of, golden teachers at 0.2 or 0.3, 4 days off, 4 days on, 3 days off. Like, do you see that as the future of microdosing, and is really sort of a quantitative and almost prescriptive approach?
Yeah, I think that will definitely be an element of it. And I think not only for microdosing, but higher doses as well. So for example, if someone struggles with PTSD, and then they heal themselves with, MDMA, we'll be able to quantify and track and measure that in terms of what MDMA dose was effective, what type of therapist did they work with, right? We'll be able to get more and more of that data to understand that relationship. Because I think ideally, that's where we want medicine to go. We want medicine to understand that if, for example, if we're measuring blood panels and we know what are ideal amounts for an individual, then how do we facilitate some sort of process to make that happen as consistently as possible? So I definitely see that in terms of specific to psychedelics, that's kind of where I want to take all of this. I want to take it outside the clinical setting, because one of the downsides to the clinical model that's developing is once, for example, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy becomes medicalized, which it looks like will happen in about 3 years. The FDA just granted breakthrough therapy status to MAPS for MDMA to treat PTSD, meaning it will be a medically available treatment by 2021. That's only going to be accessible for people who are wealthy because of the cost that it is, and it won't be covered by insurance, at least not initially. So I think one of the other keys is, okay, how do we go outside the kind of centralized clinical model and help people to facilitate their own healing? How do we empower individuals to do this at home? And I think one, the key is education, and then two, the key is personalized medicine. In other words, how can people make the best decision possible based on who their unique profile is? And that's where I want to take it. That's where I think this needs to go, because for example, we know that MDMA, in phase 2 trials, it cured PTSD in 69% of cases, which is unheard of. And the average person had treatment-resistant PTSD for 17 years.
That was the average? Wait a minute, that was the average? Whoa.
Treatment-resistant PTSD for 17 years, the average person who enrolled, and 69% of them were cured from their PTSD. And this was checked in a 12-month follow-up. So a year after, and still 69% were cured. That number could be even higher if we had personalized medicine, because then we knew that, okay, for this individual, a little more MDMA or a little less MDMA, or psilocybin instead of MDMA, or DMT. And, it's like, you can just go, you can take this in many ways in many places. And I really would like to see that happen. And I think ideally then what you do is you open source it. You start a nonprofit that focuses on personalized medicine for psychedelics. You start collecting all this big data, and then you open source it so that anyone can just plug in all their numbers online, and they'll get a customized psychedelic protocol that they can utilize at home to facilitate this process. And all of a sudden, you've democratized psychedelic medicine so that it's accessible and available to anyone who wants to use it.
Yes.
Yes, that's kind of the vision. That's where we'd like to go, and I think microdosing helps to facilitate that.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Oh, I'm so excited, man. Absolutely. I mean, that changes everything. The democratization, the open sourcing. Here are my details. Here's all my stuff. Well, you need this protocol and this. I'm with you there, dude. I want to get involved. Do you know? Is it wrong? Who's it wrong for? Who is microdosing wrong for? Who should steer clear? I mean, obviously, women, pregnant women and children, but beyond that, like, what else?
So I think it goes without, definitely is worth emphasizing that like anyone who's predisposed to psychosis or personality disorders like borderline personality or specific cases of bipolar, it's usually best to avoid microdosing. I do want to provide a caveat to that, and that I know people who have schizophrenia who have healed it with psychedelics, and I know people who have bipolar who treat it with microdosing, but at the same time, just as a general kind of catch-all risk, typically people who struggle with those things should avoid psychedelics, both microdosing and in higher doses. Other people who are struggling with microdosing, meaning it's making their condition worse than better, are people who struggle with anxiety, general anxiety, because it's seeming to make their general anxiety worse because it's speeding things up. It's making things go faster, and anxious people already have that problem where they're overthinking the future, decompartmentalizing and stressing about things. So I think that's another thing to be aware of. It seems to be those two people primarily are the ones who are struggling. Some other downsides, though, that I think are just good to be aware of is too much microdosing, as we were speaking about earlier, could lead to burnout. So it's good to match microdosing with taking care of sleep, diet, exercise, and not going too often. In other words, like when you try a microdosing protocol, the idea is to microdose a couple times a week, so 2 times per week, and to do it for maybe, an extended period of time. So that might be 8 weeks, it might be 10 weeks, it might be 12 weeks. I did it for 7 months when I did it because it was just good, and I kept going. But I think, it's also important to take breaks, because I noticed also what happened after I was microdosing for a while, and this wasn't the initial 7-month protocol, but it was further on down the line, is it did make me more impulsive and made me more likely to make decisions that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise made in a more kind of like baseline mindset. And so I remember I interviewed Stephen Kotler for our podcast, who's kind of this flow expert. I started the Flow Genome Project. And he said that it's good not to spend too much time in flow, because if you spend too much time in flow, if you're always in flow, then you tend to be impulsive and make kind of manic-like decisions. And I think that can also be a challenge with microdosing. If you're microdosing too often, then I think it can induce states of mania and make people more impulsive than they would be otherwise. So it's always good to temper a microdosing protocol with breaks, basically. So if you do it for 12 weeks, take 12 weeks off. So that way you have a clear understanding of the impact that microdosing has, and you're not totally reliant on an external substance to facilitate certain states of mind or ways of being.
What's your favorite substance to microdose?
So when I did it for 7 months, I microdosed with LSD twice a week, and LSD has always been my favorite psychedelic, but I'm starting to transition more and more away from that because it is such a commitment. It's like 12 hours. It's a long one. I've also microdosed with psilocybin mushrooms, but it's really interesting. I recently started microdosing with something called 4-ACO-DMT, which I believe I mentioned earlier, which is like an analog of psilocybin. So psilocybin analog, meaning that chemically the structure is very similar. They've just made a couple tweaks, which has then made it much more legally available because you can make it at a lab in Canada, for example, and then order it in the United States. And 4-ACO-DMT is very similar to psilocybin in that it really helps with that sort of emotional opening up, the emotional development. But I've also noticed I still maintain the sort of cognitive clarity that I really want. And so I've been microdosing with that on occasion, and that's kind of, I think, the new thing. I also microdosed with regular DMT. I was gifted a DMT vape pen at an event that I did in Bushwick about 6 months ago. So basically it was DMT in a vape pen. And so I could wake up in the morning and I could just take a hit of the DMT and then meditate. And it was really, really interesting. You basically get euphoria for about 15 to 20 minutes, a deep sense of groundedness and focus, this kind of outpouring of gratitude. And so that was also like a really interesting little experiment that I ran. So I think again, this goes back to our conversation before, in that ideally you're microdosing for a specific purpose or reason. And so I think what we'll discover as we learn more about this is if you want to be creative, you'll microdose with X. If you want to have really good sex, you'll microdose with Y. If you want to go out and go to a museum, you'll microdose with Z, whatever that might be. And I think it's up to the individual to like figure out then, what works best for them in these different protocols.
I'm struck by the clarity of your reasoning and explanation of these things. I mean, it's so well thought out, and I wonder if that's just Paul, or if that's Paul's development of his own consciousness. How has it changed you? How have these experiments added to your life? That's a softball question, if there ever was one. Like, what has it done for you?
Yeah, so I think the two main things, and the reason why I started talking about microdosing so much, is a reduction in social anxiety. So I'm more present with people, more engaged. I'm more interested in people. I'm naturally an introvert, so I tend to shy away from like a lot of sort of situations with a bunch of people. But when I microdose, a lot of that dissipates. And even after I stopped microdosing, I was just much more comfortable like being myself and interacting with people. So I think that's been the one big takeaway. I think the other thing is, the sense of creativity and like brainstorming and being able to conceptualize and visualize kind of high-end abstract ideas and then begin working towards them in a way that's productive and well thought out. And I think my ability to articulate this has definitely been helped through microdosing. In fact, it's why I microdose before I give public talks about microdosing, because it helps me with that articulation process. It helps me to easily go this point to this point to this point and then tie it all back together. But it's also, it's part of what I'm oriented towards. I mean, it is, I guess, part of, it's one of my strengths. It's hard now because I microdose consistently. I've been microdosing for, almost 3 years now. And I don't do it twice a week every week, but, I go through phases. And it's pretty consistent. It would be hard to tie or break the two apart. In other words, if you ask me, who would you be without microdosing? That would be a question that I couldn't answer, in large part because I've pretty much built my whole professional foundation on the topic of microdosing. So it's definitely helped me in many, many ways. And again, I think it just ties back to the impact that it has on the brain. Partly is that we know, like from a lot of psychedelic research, that the mechanism of action for psychedelics is to activate something called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of 14 serotonin receptors in the brain. And this specific receptor is tied to adaptability, which is basically the ability to learn new things at a faster pace, which is also tied to like neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. So in other words, through a constant microdosing regimen, you're making yourself smarter because you're activating that 5-HT2A receptor. And of course, there's these really interesting brain imaging scans from Imperial College. When they brain imaged, they did fMRI scans of people who are under the influence of, I think, psilocybin or LSD. And it shows how when you're under the influence, your brain is creating all these new novel connections. In other words, your two hemispheres, your left and your right hemispheres, start talking a lot more. And that process is also facilitated through microdosing, which then plays itself out in improvements in creativity. So it's fascinating, everything that we're learning about these substances.
And it's just beginning, right? I mean, this is
just beginning.
This is the beginning of the shift in the research and the attention and the experimentation and the testing of this thing. My mind immediately goes toward the people listening to this episode, and what they may stand to get from this, and the social anxiety aspect. And I know you know this as well as I do, is the populations of people that I work with. That's becoming more and more common. The social anxiety, for sure, it's always been there, but are edging closer to Facebook and alerts, and our faces glued to our phones, and email push notifications, and lack of deep conversations like this one. Some folks may not have a deeply involved conversation this year. They may not get into a 2-hour conversation on an interesting topic with someone, even if it's on Skype, face to face, and that's a skill that we're losing, and it's showing itself through social anxiety, and it's especially rampant in the tech scene. A lot of my clients are highly successful, highly intelligent, and that personal connection, that interconnectedness of all things and within people is becoming harder and harder for them to manage. And as they go up the ladder of their professional life, that they become more and more anxious with people, and it doesn't go away when you go home. It pervades your familial life, your romantic life. I think for the people listening to this, just the impact or the potential impact of microdosing on social anxiety is massive.
Right, and there's an explanatory mechanism for that, which I think is important also to understand, which is basically when you're microdosing, you're supercharging your serotonin system. So you're creating a lot more serotonin, and we know that increases in serotonin are related to extroversion. We know that increases in serotonin are related to being content, being more present. In fact, I was just reading the first chapter of, there's this guy, Jordan Peterson, who's kind of made the rounds as of late. He published a book called The 12 Rules for Life. And in the very first chapter, he talks about how, increases in serotonin are directly tied to more confidence, to better posture, to all these things. So I think there's also that understanding in terms of, why are you more extroverted and more confident when you're microdosing? Well, it's because you're pumping that serotonin a little bit harder. But of course, that's not the only thing that you can use to improve, serotonin levels. There's obviously, like we talked about before, diet, sleep, and exercise. But microdosing is another thing that can do that, because it puts you in a more present place with other people. And like you said, because we've become so immersed in these like smartphones and computers and stuff, that's just an element that we're really missing out on. I think it needs to be revitalized for us to live meaningful, purpose-driven lives. It's relationship, deep relationship.
Yeah, the potential there, I think, is massive. If people knew, because we sell a serotonin brain food product. It's all natural and open source. You know what's in it. Each batch is tested, and it has quickly climbed to like the number 2 bestseller of the products that we carry, because people need it. They're depleting themselves of it. They're not making enough, and it's wreaking havoc on their social lives, and it's increasing anxiety for them, and it's making every aspect of their life more challenging. So much more. We could go all day. Paul.
We could.
We really could. Well, talk a little bit more about the work that you do with Third Wave, specifically the team and the people that you work with, and what sort of service you guys provide.
Yeah, so I mean, the focal point of the Third Wave is to change the cultural conversation around psychedelics through the topic of microdosing. And as we were speaking about earlier in the conversation, we really do this by rebranding psychedelics, by getting people to associate psychedelics with engagement, opportunity, potentially productivity or creativity, this sort of thing. And it's been a quick process in terms of growth, quicker than I anticipated, certainly, which has led to a number of amazing opportunities. And one of those amazing opportunities is just the team that we've been able to build, many of whom are working for the love of the mission rather than any sort of financially driven incentive. Because thus far it's been difficult to figure out what is a sustainable business plan. Is that for profit? Is that social impact? Is that nonprofit? And then how do we go about facilitating that. So obviously the main thing that we've been offering is a microdosing course, which is an online, self-study course for people who really want to optimize their microdosing protocol, because we noticed that there were a number of issues that people had when they started microdosing. One, are you taking the right amount? And so this is about calibrating dose level. And a big part of having a successful microdosing protocol is taking the right amount for you. So figuring that out. Two, how do you track and measure the actual changes? And how do you match microdosing with other modalities, meditation, float tanks, whatever it might be, to really improve everything that's going on? And then three, a community. Because a lot of people who are getting into microdosing, again, because of the cultural stigma that exists around psychedelics, are doing it alone. They're isolated. And so we wanted to connect them with other microdosers who they could be in touch with. So that's kind of then been the main thing that we've been offering. Then we have like some microdosing kits and a few other things. But the next big project that we're doing, and I think I mentioned this briefly, is something called Synthesis, which is in-person retreat. Again, oriented towards these same objectives: creativity, personal development, self-actualization, whatever it might be, a deeper understanding of yourself. And we're doing that legally in Amsterdam with psilocybin truffles. And that's not microdoses; those are moderate to higher doses, with guides in a very in a professional outdoor setting. And I think that's really where this model is going more and more towards. Is it's offering consulting, coaching, retreats for people who want to utilize this in a way that facilitates deep transformation in a short period of time. Because, as I've kind of been glossing over this entire conversation, from my perspective, psychedelics are the X factor. They're something that, because they've been so culturally misunderstood, people are missing out on a significant opportunity to improve their quality of life with psychedelics. And I think the sooner people have a higher degree of psychedelic literacy, the sooner they understand the best way that they can utilize these substances, the sooner that they will live the life that they want to live in a way that has meaning, has purpose, has energy, vitality, all of these virtue, whatever things that people value and they want. And so I think that's kind of still the overarching focus is literacy. It's education, and it's making sure that people rationally understand these substances so that they can make a decision about them that's based not in fear but logic.
Have you gotten a lot of support? Did you guys sell out the Synthesis trip to Amsterdam? I mean, did you get a lot of good feedback?
Yeah. So we're doing the first one April 15. So we have 3 retreats that are each 3 days: April 15 through 17, 18 through 20, and 20 through 22. And we have all 24 participants, or all 24 slots have been sold out. So like that response has been really, really good, and I've been just ecstatic about getting that sort of response. So basically, because it was so successful in terms of attracting people, obviously we're going to do the retreat in a couple weeks and see how that goes. But then we're offering a second retreat at the end of July, early August, starting to get people enrolled for that as well. Because we think really, this should be a pillar of psychedelic experiences going forward, because we already have, the therapeutic clinical model is already starting to develop, as we've talked about. There is the spiritual model, which I would tie mostly to ayahuasca retreats. And then there's the recreational model, which is obviously like taking psychedelics at festivals. But there's really no model for the betterment of well-being, for self-actualization, for creativity. And so that's really what we're developing with Synthesis, is, using this in a responsible, integrated setting to facilitate deep self-awareness and self-understanding. And I'm really excited for it, really excited to see how it develops and what happens with it, because it's a fun project. It's a really fun project.
Well, I think there's obviously a massive value in that sort of immersive experience where you can actually go and be with other. I mean, if you can't get to Peru to partake in ayahuasca ceremonies or San Pedro or whatever, if that's not accessible to you, or if that's not your game, if you're not into 6 hours of vomiting and Icaros that turn you inside out in the most beautiful way possible, that immersive experience where you can be with other people in a controlled setting where people are helping facilitate these experiences, I have no doubt that that's going to continue to gain popularity. Do you know, are you guys really detailed with like dosage and what's in the truffle? Like, do you spend a lot of time making sure that that's just right?
So that's what we're really starting to develop right now is, one issue with truffles still is nausea. So like one of the big challenges is making sure people don't puke them back up after they eat them. So we're making a tea out of the truffles and then serving that. So that's kind of what we have a couple team members who are in Amsterdam, and that's what they're working on right now in terms of then what's the ideal, density or whatever of the tea that we can serve to facilitate certain processes. So that will be a matter of experimentation. Yeah. In terms of figuring that out, we have a rough idea, but that will be one of the main things that we'll have to start. Well, that we'll need to get more clarity on through this first process.
Yeah. Yeah. There's the nausea thing. There's that feeling where it gets to your liver and you go, the liver says, wait a minute, we don't know what this is. You've been poisoned. Time to kick fight or flight or freeze mode. And I think that for those of the listeners that have done that before, they've experienced that moment where it's like, oh, here it goes, whether you start to yawn or smile, but that, you get a little bit of a side ache, that all familiar reaction. There's the mitigation of eating it raw, you have to eat higher doses, but that eating the raw psilocybin mitigates that gut ache. But, I don't know if that's something that you want to get into or not, but, well, We could easily go 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, but I know that you're a busy man. You jumped from one call into this one, but we're just starting the conversation, Paul.
I know. So we should continue. We should maybe do another one. I do have to get going soon though, just because I have to eat some lunch. And then I have to do a podcast interview for my podcast with. Do you know who Ingmar Gorman is? Do you know who Ingmar is? No. Probably not. He's leading the MDMA phase 3 trials in New York for MAPS. So and he's kind of like skeptical on microdosing. So we're having an interview going back and forth about microdosing.
Excellent. Well, this is the perfect segue to please tell people how they can get a hold of you, how they can get in touch with you, reach out and connect. Like give us all your vitals.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people want to learn more about microdosing, I would say go to the Third Wave. So thethirdwave.co. Okay, co.com.co. And we have a bunch of education information resources there. We also have the microdosing course if this is something that people really want to take to the next level. And then, like I mentioned before, if anyone is interested in utilizing this in a professional retreat setting, we're doing legal retreats in Amsterdam, and that is synthesisretreat.com. And then I'm on Twitter at PaulAustin3W. If you want to tweet at me or just say hi, I'd be happy to chat with anyone who has listened to the podcast and wants to reach out and has any other questions.
Awesome. I think people are going to love this content, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us on the OPP today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean, for providing this platform and having me on. And it was a blast to chat with you for a while.
For additional insights and practical lessons based on this show, go to naturalstacks.com. The Optimal Performance Podcast is a Natural Stacks original. Our executive producers are Dennis Buckley and myself, Sean McCormick. Our producer is Christian Randall. OPP intro music by Odyssey. Additional music provided by That New Jam, a Randy McCrandle production.